What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bitcoin and Markets. My name is Ansel Lindner. Sunday live stream. Welcome to the show. We are going to go over Lynn Alden, Brent Johnson on Mark Moss's podcast, debating about what is money, what is the state of money, where are we going, is it possible for Bitcoin to become a global reserve currency, all of that stuff. Before we jump into that debate, let's just take a quick look at the Bitcoin price being on a Sunday. Shouldn't be all that crazy. And what I'm going to do is I'm live streaming on Telegram and on YouTube. I'm going to switch screens here. There we go. All right. So, sorry, my messaging. I forgot to mute my notifications. Okay. So, what we're seeing here is the Bitcoin price, and we've come up to this trend line we've been in for a couple weeks. This top trend line. This was the $80,000 or 80,000 Bitcoin sale. This dump right here it barely moved the price 1 or 2% for the day. We didn't even close very much. Let's see, how much were we down on that day? 0.5% on the day that they dumped 80,000 BTC. We already have some tweets from Saylor saying he's starting to buy again. And yeah, so this is very, very stable market. I'm surprised that this level has provided this much resistance. We can put that down to maybe some of these large sellers happy selling right now. I don't know why, if they were selling at 20,000, why didn't they sell at 112? Doesn't make any sense. But that's what we got going on for price. Expect to break out this week, or at least very, very soon. And being the weekend, there's not much to talk about for other markets. Okay, also share this tab. This is bitcoinandmarkets.com. Put out a post just today. This is a free blog post out there for everybody. Not premium only. Most of my stuff has been going premium on the premium side, but this one is out there for everybody. And it's in response to a tweet that I had yesterday. Somebody was talking about sub-Saharan Africa and why they didn't have great civilizations. And then someone else responded saying, hey, Mesoamerica had all the same disadvantages as sub-Saharan Africa, but it did have a civilization. So all of those geographic differences or geographic limitations don't matter. All right. And so I responded, this is my response to that. Let's just go through a few of these reasons. First off, it's amazing that Mesoamerica developed in pure isolation. It's truly an impressive feat because no other civilization did that. We can go to Indus Valley, Fertile Crescent, Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, the Varna culture. Maybe you could say the Chinese developed in somewhat isolation, but really they didn't, because they got horses and chariots and perhaps even metallurgy from the West, from the steppes. And the steppes, were the highway of the day where everybody kind of, all the cultures intermingled, and we had the Indo-European migrations. But so no other culture besides the Mesoamericans developed in complete isolation. So it is a really, really impressive feat. So what are some of the differences between Mesoamerica and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa? First and foremost is the rivers. So it's not a coincidence that all civilizations sprung up around rivers. They arose there because rivers provided the essential ingredients of permanent settlement, agricultural surplus, and social complexity. But not just any rivers will do. Certain types of rivers offer unique geographic and ecological advantages that allowed human societies to cross the critical threshold from subsistence to civilization. And you can see the Nile, the Euphrates and Tigris, the Indus River, and the Yellow River, and the Yangtze, but mainly the Yellow River in ancient China. So rivers, they provided everything. And so this is geographic determinism. not every place is as equally well suited to civilization popping up, right? And so that has to be part of our macro analysis when we're looking at the world. We can't just say X country has the best political policies or the best economic policies, so it is going to be the most successful. No, it doesn't matter if you have the best policies and you're Nepal, okay? You're never going to have a massive economy. You're never going to be a world leader, those types of things. Okay, so geography rules everything. And anyway, so here is the river system of this part of Mesoamerica. Of course, you can go into the central part of Mexico and a little bit more south than this along the Pacific coast. But you can see it's crisscrossed by a lot of rivers. You can pretty much go anywhere in this place by rivers. And it has these inlets, estuaries, harbors, natural harbors all along here, even on the Pacific side, that helped trade. Okay, the rivers help trade and all that, but Africa doesn't have that. Here's an example. So Niger, the Niger River, only up to this first city, Onitsha. I don't know how to pronounce these, but Onitsha, it's I don't know, 100 miles inland or something like that. That's the only part of the river that's navigable all year round. This little tiny piece by the coast. From here up to Jebba, that's navigable for about 9 months a year, maybe 6 to 9 months. But past this, it's only navigable for a couple months a year during the rainy season. Even by like medium-sized boats. I mean, maybe canoes, you could say, could do it, but there's rapids. There many parts of the rivers actually dry up completely and are separated during the dry season, so they aren't navigable even by canoe. So that's what Africa is dealing with. And this is one of the best rivers in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's only navigable this tiny bit to the sea. They're also, look at where's the next river mouth, this Volta River, maybe that's a minor one. I mean, you have to go all the way down hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to the next river mouth, where when you're going in Central America, I mean, boom, 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 you're just right next door. You can travel along the coast, have some nice estuary protection, and then jump into the next river system and trade and do your messages and organize and all that stuff. Okay, so the rivers were a big deal. Soil. So Mesoamerica has great soil. It's volcanic. What's the term? Do I include the term of it? But there's volcanic ash that adds in potassium, and it's pretty fertile. Okay, the high yield agriculture can be done there. And then, of course, you have irrigation with all the river system. In contrast, this is sub-Saharan Africa. They have chronically poor soils. Much of the continent sits on an ancient, heavily weathered landmass with soils like oxils and ultisols that are nutrient depleted, acidic, and prone to leaching. That's one reason why they had to have a ton of fertilizer going to Africa. And during COVID and also during the kickoff of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, people were worried about fertilizer supply chains. And if Africa was cut off from fertilizer, they would have mass famine there. So yeah, they have to, it's dependent, a lot of their agriculture is dependent on outside fertilization and modern techniques of fertilization and stuff. And so that's soil is a really big reason why they never developed a lot of civilization there. Even the river valleys, African soils are very swampy, inconsistent, and disease-prone, limiting their utility. The lack of fertile, easily cultivated land contributed directly to lower population densities, fewer food surpluses, and slower civilizational development. Okay, disease and the tsetse fly. So sub-Saharan Africa is severely constrained by endemic disease, especially the tsetse fly and malaria. The tsetse fly, prevalent across much of the region, transmits sleeping sickness to livestock, making cattle, horses, and other draft animals unusable in wide areas. This crippled agriculture, transport, and military capacity Malaria further reduced human population density and labor productivity, particularly in tropical zones, making it difficult for complex urban civilizations to take root. And here's a map of where the tsetse fly range is. It even stretches down into, South Central Africa, Rhodesia, Namibia is over here. Not into South Africa, but quite a ways down. In contrast, Mesoamerica lacked domesticated large animals altogether, but also lacked the devastating diseases. Agriculture remained manual, but human populations were not biologically suppressed. They did have some livestock, like they did raise turkeys and ducks, I think. But they didn't have chickens. They didn't have goats, sheep, cattle, horses, any of those type of livestock. It was turkeys, ducks, and beans, corn, and squash. That's what they pretty much survived on. But they didn't have the tsetse fly and stuff like that. So that was a big, big plus. Building materials and monumental architecture. So Mesoamerica had limestone. I mean, it's just a big one. The Yucatan is like one big limestone outcrop. Okay. And that's a very soft stone that you can work with some harder stones. Okay. So you get some harder stone tools and you can beat on the limestone and you can quarry it and you can build things out of it. But you can't do that in sub-Saharan Africa because there's limited limestone quarrying abilities. It's mostly igneous and metamorphic rock like granite and basalt, which is extremely hard and takes metal tools, more advanced civilization to actually quarry this, transport it, lift it, place it, build this monumental architecture. I mean, of course, the Egyptians figured it out. They had a lot of sandstone around, but they also built with granite and basalt, things like that. But sub-Saharan Africa never quite figured that out because they had harder stone. So that benefits Mesoamerica too, just having a lot of soft stone to build things out of. So conclusion is navigable rivers, fertile soil, a benign disease environment, and workable stone is what let Mesoamerica have civilizations. Sub-Saharan Africa, despite its rich cultures, faced poor soils, deadly diseases, fragmented waterways, and scarce building materials. So going back to this guy that said, that spawned this whole reaction, this tweet, they had the same problems. No, they didn't. I disagree that they had the same problems. Mesoamerica had many advantages over sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so that is that. But let's get to what we really came here for, and that is to react to this one, I believe. Yep, I got it queued up. Uh-oh, what happened to this? Share screen again. Which one? Yeah, here we go. And let's make sure, yeah, you guys are seeing that as well over there on Telegram. Let me see if there's any comments yet. Dex Invictus back with us. What's going on? Rare Sunday live stream. If you guys are watching on Telegram, you can put your chat in Telegram as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this started. Brett Johnson, he is a fellow Nebraskan. That's where I was born and raised, and that's where he was born and raised. He was on the extreme western side of the state in, Timbuktu, but I was in Omaha, which is a slightly larger city. So I like his stuff. He's a dollar bull, and I'm a dollar bull as well. So I like that about him. But I think he has some blind spots that we will see here, mainly around history, mainly around monetary history, and also just like game theory and human nature. I think he probably is well read on it, but we'll see in here that a lot of his views I don't think hold up. And Lynn does a good job pointing things out. I think, again, she's more eloquent than I am, and so she uses bigger words and probably explains it better, where I am more direct about my stuff. But the main one thing I wanted to point out here before we press play is they're talking about fiat currency. Okay, so Brent is saying fiat, saying that the elites the issuer controls the currency. in this case, the government or the elites, and they aren't going to be forced to accept or change or do anything that they don't want to do. That's why Bitcoin probably won't work, won't become global reserve currency. Where Lynn is saying, "Oh no, it's more complicated than that. They're not omnipotent, right?" But anyway, the point here is fiat currency. We don't have fiat currency right now. We have credit-based currency. So fiat currency, if you think about a balance sheet, assets and liabilities, fiat currency is when if you print money, you just add assets. They're unencumbered. You just add a balance into your account. That would be printing money, fiat money. But when you have credit-based money, you print an asset and a liability. And it functions way differently. That's why it's been able to last for so long. This experiment that we're doing, the euro dollar or credit-based money, because it has that liability attached to it, and that gives it some more stability. But anyway, so I just wanted to point that out. So let's listen to the first part of this. I'll try not to interrupt too much while reacting, because it is a little bit longer. Let's see, did I speed it up? Yeah, I sped up 1.25. So let's go. Come on. Ding, 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 ding. Should I refresh the page? That's the question. Let's go ahead and do that. It wasn't playing for some reason.
We are here to talk about the role of money and power structures. And this got kicked off with a firestorm with Brent Johnson, a.k.a. Santiago Capital, and, of course, Lynn Alden. And I've known Brent for a long time. I consider him a friend. He's the nicest guy in the world, but he loves to make a point on X. And he threw out something. I forget what it was. I made a comment about it. And then Lynn jumped in on that. Thanks so much. And Lynn is not argumentative like Santiago Cap on X, but she will not back down by her jiu-jitsu background, whatever that she has. And she made some really good points, and the thread went on and on and on and on. And we thought, why don't we just discuss this? Obviously, most people realize X is not the best place to have a conversation, and so it's probably better to do it in long form. So anyway, thank you, Brent and Lynn, for joining me on this. I have some kind of questions lined up. We'll figure out where we can see where these differences are in the in our ideas, and we'll sort of frame that up. But it sort of started kind of from this whole idea, or I guess what the role of money should be. And I think there's definitions that are in that, but let's just go ahead and kind of frame.
Let me make sure this is sharing audio. I had a sinking feeling. So stop sharing. I will reshare. Yeah, I think it was sharing audio. Okay. So let's go.
This up, right? I think basically what you're trying to make the point of, Brent, is that money is primarily a tool for governments to maintain power covertly rather than serving the individual's interest. And I think that's what it is. Lynn, how do you see this? I mean, is that what you see sort of the disagreement, Lynn? And then how do you see the current monetary system fit into that framework?
I would say that's what most monies are today, or more specifically, what most currencies are today. I think the broader term of money that's a superset. It has a bigger meaning than that. It's basically the ledger that people use when they do trade or to store liquid value. And so there's obviously certain commodities that have been used for money. In the current day, we now have entirely digital monies and everything in between. But I would say that it's not that I disagree necessarily with that definition that was proposed. I just think that's only a subset of it.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I had this pulled up, I think. Yeah. So share this tab instead. So what is money? The origins of money. We kind of know what it is. And these two, I'm sure Lynn Alden has really good understanding of this. I think Brent does as well. But this is just a blog post I wrote a couple months ago responding to Jesse Myers. So Nick Szabo's work talks about the deep roots of money. In it, he argues that the money originated as an evolutionary tool for managing trust and reciprocity in early human societies. Long before states or markets, scarce and costly collectibles served as proto-money, enabling cooperation and reputation building beyond immediate kin. Money, in this view, emerged from the social pressures of increasing complex group life. Okay, so just a little bit more on what money is. I would say it's something that fulfills the functions of money, and that would be unit store value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. It's not very hard. Brent is going to try to make this into this is a top-down control mechanism. That's a chartalist view. So chartalism is that money is a creation of the state, and the main what they say, money emerged because they needed a way to pay the soldiers, and so they paid them in these coins, and they forced the people to accept these coins in payment. Okay, and we know that that's not how money started. Money is a bottom up adoption, not a top down. Even though we have like these institutions adopting Bitcoin right now, and some people say this is a top down adoption of Bitcoin because it's the large institutions, but these institutions are not the state. They are elites in some cases, but they aren't. It's still they're people like all of us. Okay, from the very beginning of my involvement in Bitcoin, going back to like when I first learned about it. Well, when I first had understanding about it, we can go to like 2014. Okay. And even back then, I was saying that Bitcoin works on the individual. So these institutions are not like beings in and of themselves. They're run by individuals, right? Just governments are run by individuals. They're just a label to a group of individuals. And so these institutions are not adopting Bitcoin. It's the individuals within the institutions that are convinced and that are adopting Bitcoin. It's all an individual grassroots sort of thing. It's not any sort of top-down monolith that is pushing Bitcoin. But anyway, let's get back into it.
And then Brent, for you, I mean, you know, your dollar milkshake theory, I'm not sure if that kind of frames up that perspective, but maybe your argument is that money's primary purpose is to work for governments. I mean, tell me how that fits into that.
Yeah,
framework.
so I think largely this topic gets down to what people want versus what actually is. And I stress that point all the time, but I stress it all the time because I think it's really, really important. And the reason I think it's really important is most of the people I interact with,
I like that. And I try to do the same thing. I try to be descriptive as much as possible and not prescriptive. That's what he's talking about here. Because people they're too concerned about what they think is the best way to do something and not how it actually evolved. Because, you know, there could be impossibilities in there. So maybe, yes, it would be great to have society or money a certain way. But to get from A to B is impossible. So why waste your time talking about the perfect system that you want to have if getting there is impossible? And that's what Brent is trying to say. He's trying to say, I'm talking about what it is in reality. And I love that about his analysis.
in the financial space, right? The investment space, people's nest eggs, people's retirement, people's, their assets. And nothing is more important than that, other than maybe their families. And so I think it's really important to deal with reality when you're dealing with other people's money, or assets, however we want to define that term. And I think from a philosophical standpoint, I'm probably very much in line with you guys on what I would like money to be. It's just my experience that that's not what it actually is. And I think, it is my opinion, and I know people disagree with me, I think most of history would back me up on that. It's not to say that there hasn't been a time, or there couldn't be a time, when money was chosen freely by the market and it was entered into in voluntary exchange. I just don't think that tracks with much of historical record. And so I think that's the kind of the point that I typically try to get across when I'm talking about these issues.
Okay. So there's a difference of what we think it could be, what we want it to be, and versus what it is. So to your point, it's sort of like made up in our mind, but the government's really going to exert its power over what they want money to be.
Yeah. So I'll give you a really good example, and this will tie perfectly in with all of Lynn's work. And listen, Lynn's great, and Lynn has done incredible work. And I read her book, Broken Money, and I like the title, Broken Money. I think it's very apropos, but I think it's very apropos from the individual's perspective. I don't think it's necessarily apropos from the issuer's perspective. And so I think for the most part, money is working for those who issue it. Now we're kind of getting into an area where it's not working as well as it once.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. And I see how that could be the case. But issuers are individuals too. So he's like, it works from the individual's perspective, or it's broken from the individual's perspective, but not from the issuer's perspective. Well, who are the issuers? They are individuals themselves. They're not some monolith. Okay. People backstab people. There's conspiracies, short-term. I believe in short-term conspiracies, not necessarily long-term conspiracies, but there are constant shifts in who is the elite, which party is in power, going back and forth. If some group, some rival group could get a leg up by adopting some new form of money, why wouldn't they do that? So no, we're all individuals. Issuers are individuals. There's no monolithic issuer. There's no monolithic government. There's no monolithic elites out there. They're all individuals, and they all have differing incentives. And a lot of times, they're within that class of people, their incentives don't align, and so they'll fight each other. I mean, what do you think interstate rivalries are? It's just a bunch of elites fighting other elites. And if one set of elites in one country will get a leg up by adopting gold, and then they did it, a decade before another country, and they benefited, then the country that didn't adopt a gold standard will be forced to adopt that gold standard if they want to compete. If the elites want to compete with the other elites, see, it's not a monolith around the world of what is money. It's all competitive, and it's all evolving in a complex system.
Was, and perhaps we're going to have some changes as a result. But I think oftentimes when people talk about this issue, they talk about it from the individual's perspective and what would be good for the individual. And that's great. And I love that. And I would love a world where that was the case. I just don't think that that's typically the way it actually is. It kind of goes back to my first point.
All right, Lynn.
Yeah,
what do you have to say?
So a couple points. One is we can separate this over time, right? And so before the Fiat age, most governments around the world, most kingdoms or empires, whatever the political structure is at a given time, most of them had to tie their money to something of external value like gold, silver, or other types of commodity monies, because they had a limited ability to just impose something that's entirely artificial over a public over a long period of time. Generally speaking, experiments that just totally deviated from that, like paper money in early China, didn't last super long. And while there was seigniorage and there was debasement,
Okay. Question from Michael on YouTube. Do I post my live stream schedule? No, I was live streaming on Wednesday and Friday, but it can be any day if there's some important information drop, like an FOMC meeting or a CPI drop or something like that. I'll live stream on a different day, but there is no real schedule. Sorry about that. This is a impromptu Sunday stream because I was on vacation last week. I didn't stream last week, so I kind of wanted to make up a little bit for it here on the weekend. If you join the Telegram, I do talk about it more in the Telegram. I did say I was going to live stream this weekend at some point, so you could check that out. He said I'm a pro member, and I'm just seeing this now. Well, we kind of just started. Sorry, I should have tweeted out earlier today. Okay, great. Well, welcome. I hope you can join us. Put any questions, comments down below, guys. Let me check Telegram before I press play again. Not seeing any comments over there. Okay, let's keep it rolling. I'm going to rewind a few seconds.
Tie their money to something of external value like gold, silver, or other types of commodity monies, because they had a limited ability to just impose something that's entirely artificial over a public over a long period of time. Generally speaking, experiments that just totally deviated from that, like paper money in early China, didn't last super long. And while there was seigniorage and there was debasement, when a lot of people reading this or watching this are probably familiar with the long-term chart of Roman currency debasement. It's important to remember that was over a 2-century period. there were more frictions against debasement because of what they were working with at the time. One of the things I point out in Broken Money is that in the invention of telecommunications, so starting with the telegraph and of course expanding from there, that opened a really big speed arbitrage, which gave banks and governments a lot of power to really shift things in their favor. And I agree with Brent that there's a difference between the user of the money and the issue of money. I even touch on that in Broken Money, where I have a page or so dedicated to the issuer's perspective versus the user's perspective. And so that part I don't disagree with, other than to say that we've finally reached a technological point where there's actually some way to combat that. So you have this kind of century and a half period where transactions could move at the speed of light, but there's really no way to do final settlement at that speed. And so we're reliant on these big centralized ledgers to kind of fill the gap. And the invention of Bitcoin opens that back up. And then of course you're bootstrapping from zero, right? Some small team or guy on the internet in 2009. That takes years or decades to ramp up to have significant scale, liquidity, durability, and just overall functionality, and an app system building on top of it. But for the first time in history, there's actually alternatives that can move just as quickly. And so while it's,
I think this is a great point, and she's putting him to shame. If you listen to Brent's level of analysis, it's I want it to be a certain way, but it's not a certain way. And then here comes Lynn Alden on the mic, and she's like, boom, bang, look at this. This is how it is. Gold standard, Roman debasement, telecommunications era, final settlement, like bam, 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 just with just another higher level of understanding this. And I think that's very good for this particular discussion. Brent shines perhaps more in insight, in unique insight. And I think that's kind of maybe where I have an advantage too, is just a unique global insight and picking out certain trends and other things that people might not see, or taking perhaps seemingly disparate events and disparate trends and making them as part of a holistic trend. And Brent has a way of doing something similar to that. So yeah, I just think it's awesome. Now, on her point of debasement, it's interesting because like with Rome, and they debased their coins, what did they do? Debasement doesn't mean making more silver coins, right? That's not debasement. If you dig out more silver and you make more silver coins, that's not debasement, correct? I think I'm right on that. What's debasement is decreasing the percentage of precious metal, right? Going from 95% down to 90, down to 75, down to half, all the way down to 5% silver in your coin. That's debasement. So with that thought, or with that definition, are we debasing the dollar? No. The dollar is currently not being debased. A credit-based money cannot be debased. It can be inflated, yes. It can be depreciated, but it can't be debased. Debased is for a currency that is backed by something, and the amount of the something that's being backed by is being diminished. So that's just a small point of vocabulary that I think people kind of get mixed up with. The dollar is not being debased. Okay.
Still certainly the case that, out of 180 or so currencies around the world, all these little local monopolies, the issuers are doing that for a reason. They're extracting value from it. But there are ways around it now. And this whole debate started out the topic of whether or not Bitcoin is money or has monetary aspects. And so I think that while I fully agree that it's important to acknowledge reality, it's also important to acknowledge that details of reality shift over time, especially with technology. That's kind of a persistent and global shift over time, as well as, of course, politics and other things that lay on top of it.
Boom.
Yeah, go ahead, jump in, Brent. You guys can just.
Well, so I think she's right.
Mark is like, well, she schooled you. Go ahead, Brent.
If you go back throughout history, there were periods of time where, sovereigns, kings, queens, whoever, governments tied their money to something of value. But there's very little evidence, anthropological evidence, written evidence that, barter ever existed on any large scale. And in fact, if you go way back and you actually look at the written history, most times the written history, now it's not to say that
What does it have to do with barter? Is he saying because commodity money is just barter, money is as a good is barter? That doesn't, no. Money that's based on something like gold, anytime you have money, it's not barter by definition. You have money. There's an indirect transaction, right? Indirect. You have money is not a direct good. It's an indirect good. You exchange it in order to use it in the future. And Bitcoin is actually the most perfect indirect good you can have. Gold is an indirect good mostly, but there is some direct use of gold, like jewelry, dentistry, electronics, perhaps you could say. So there are direct uses of gold, which get in the way of the indirect use of gold for money. So Bitcoin has no real direct use. It's all indirect. It's a perfect monetary good in that respect. It really, is there a way it could be beaten? I mean, there's possibility that somehow in the future, somebody comes up with a better indirect good, maybe more divisible, maybe lighter weight, like not having to have such a big blockchain or something like that. But really, in the foreseeable future, there is not, Bitcoin cannot be improved. I mean, Bitcoin is a holistic thing. It's not one technology. It's not multiple technologies put together. It's one gigantic technology that allows for this perfect indirect good. And so is he saying barter? Gold is barter somehow? I don't know.
There couldn't be something before history, before written history, where they did barter. But if you go back to the historical records, most of it is written down, and that which is written down shows that money was a form of debt, and it started off as keeping track of who owed who what. So again, we get back to a ledger, right? There's no evidence that original ledger had to be tied to gold. It's not that it couldn't be, but there's no evidence that says that is the case. Now, I actually like the idea of this, but when I've done the research to actually find the evidence, I can't find it. So if you,
I'm gonna love what Lynn says here, because that is just crazy. That's crazy. People paid with gold and silver coins.
You can find the evidence that shows that money was derived from something of value, and then the kings or queens or sovereigns adopted it. I'm open to that, but that's just not the historical information that I have found. But there's plenty of information arguing the other way, saying that it was actually a system of credits, a system of debts, and that was kind of imposed by the sovereign. That was the way the sovereign provisioned for themselves.
Okay, he's going down the book Debt the Last 5,000 Years or something like that. It's a commie idea, and I can't believe Brent is biting off on this. No, money did not originate as debt. Debt, it was a concept that arrived later, after civilization. No, you never had. I mean, just think about going back and you're paying a bride price to a neighboring tribe person. You wouldn't have debt with them. No, you pay them in a cow to go along with your daughter, or the other way around. They pay a cow to get your daughter. No, there was no debt before civilization, but there was money. There definitely was money that was being used in this. And you go back to Nick Szabo, pull this one up. So Nick Szabo saying that he argues that money originated as an evolutionary tool for managing trust and reciprocity in early human societies. So how could you have debt if there was no trust and reciprocity? So you had to be exchanging something of value to build that trust. You couldn't just say, I owe you this, I owe you that. Maybe inside of a tribe, and somebody was successful in their hunt, and then they said, okay, I'll let you eat some today, but if you catch something tomorrow, then you feed my family tomorrow. Okay, that would be a form of debt in a kin group, but not that as a form of money. Okay, money came after civilization. All right. And I wasn't sharing that tab, but let's just keep on.
Now, perhaps it wasn't an organized government like we think it is now, but if you go back to, the whole clan of the cave bear or whatever it was, the biggest, strongest guy kind of said, this is the way things are going to be. And there is evidence that that is the case, but there's not a lot of evidence that, we traded fish for goats and then goats for, strips of leather and then strips of leather for shoes and da-da-da-da. It's a nice way of explaining things, and it's a nice way to talk about how things could have developed in a free market where there wasn't an imposition from some big mean guy or girl, dictating to us how to act. But the historical record just doesn't back it up. And so
he's just completely and utterly wrong here. They would have very limited control over a very limited number of people. And the next town over would have another strong man. And how do those towns trade with each other? They have to use money. So this is elite to elite competition. You have to use money. You have to use what the other people are accepting. You have to. It's very limited. I can't believe he's saying this, to be honest with you.
And so that it's, we kind of get into a little philosophical thing of here. Is money what the sovereign demands? Is it the token demanded by the sovereign in the form of tribute, or is it the most marketable commodity that is chosen by free individuals? I certainly like the second one a lot better. I just haven't found a lot of evidence to support it.
Well, what evidence is there that they aren't the same? Like, why wouldn't the sovereign want the most marketable thing? Of course he would. Of course he would. The sovereign would want the most marketable thing. That's what they are going to demand. So they're the same thing, Brent. There's no choice there. It's not either or. They're both the same thing.
Well, I think we need more nuance than that. I mean, one thing I'd point out is that in the first part of Broken Money, I had a whole section devoted to kind of undermining the barter concept. So I would agree with you there that basically that if anything, social credit was right alongside any sort of usage of physical monies. But one additional nuance we can put, because we got earlier than something like a sovereign, is that basically that social credit would be used in fairly small groups, because it's only as good as to the extent that you either know the person and they're reputationally enforcing their debts and credits, or a small enough kind of tight someone who can abjure and say that this agreement is valid. And so, but once you get to
that's exactly what I said. She just said it more eloquently than I did. You have to have like some sort of adjudication, and the strong man isn't necessarily imposing his will as much as he is adjudicating issues within the tribe. One of the things I've been learning some more things about the Bible and stuff, and about Moses, and how a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament is how to form a society in general, or how to form a civilization, how to live with each other. And Moses's role was as an adjudicator. He would sit over in judgment of different disputes amongst the people. So that's what a lot of the rulers would be doing. They wouldn't be imposing their will necessarily. They would be trying to figure out a way for people to live together and be prosperous and multiply, be fruitful and multiply, right? It's not, yes, there are times and periods where you find benevolent, is that the right word? No, that's the opposite. That you find evil rulers, okay, that want to just impose their will on people. But most of the time, it's the rulers trying to have the best society. They're competing against other societies and neighboring places that want to destroy them, want to kill their men and steal their women away. And so what do? They have to build a successful society. They're not there to impose their whims. They're there to build a successful society, to protect their people, to protect their women, to protect their livelihoods and their property and all that stuff. I mean, I don't know what kind of view Brent has about, like, are all in the ancient times, prehistoric times, even maybe just borderline between prehistoric and historic times, were these leaders that really wanted to kill each other and fight each other and have war with each other? Were they actually some cabal and they got together? They met at the lake side and they said, hey, let's impose these different things on our people. Like, we're the elites. Let's exploit them. No, they didn't do that. They were all competing against each other.
Point where you're trading with people you don't know. That's where the kind of the informal credit system breaks down. You either need a larger system of communication and banks, which came later, or that's where they would fall back on something more physical. And so there's early evidence and also kind of more recent hunter-gatherer evidence of things like beads being used as money. There are certain things that would emerge before gold even, where combined with social credit, they'd be used as a form of liquid or final settlement that is not relying on the ongoing obligation. And then when we look back at like the earlier records that we have, like some of the earliest forms of writing, like in Babylon, even then the sovereign's money was tied to something of physical value, things like grains, things like silver. But that of course came later than the whole, the Paleolithic period. So I'm right there with you that money goes back to social credit, at least alongside commodities, maybe not instead of it, but alongside it. But it's not like it merely originated as a tool of the sovereign, because all of this discussion even pre-exists as something like an actual sovereign. In small social groups, as well as just between groups that otherwise don't know each other. So even then, money is a superset of just a form of control or form of issuance of a sovereign. It's something that emerges, but then also at times is imposed, depending on the region. But even when it's imposed, it often has to have some tether to reality. Otherwise, it's generally not very long lasting. It's easy to disrupt. It's so easy to game that it just goes away, and then you have to start fresh with something that's more tied to reality.
I think also that control of the money, like Brent is saying here, I think that's a very modern concept. Even if you go back to the medieval times and stuff, they kind of understood that debasing their coins would give them more money so that they could do their wars. Okay, so they could pay their soldiers. But as a form of control, I don't think that even really crossed anyone's mind until extremely recently. Maybe the last 200 years, maybe the last, probably back into 1700. So in the era of central banking, let's say, that started to become an idea of a way to control people through the financial system. But that wasn't even how they viewed money going back to the 1500s or the year 1000. I mean, your title and your nobility and your land was way more important than the actual money. And they just saw money as a way to like pay soldiers and do that. That's how they would control. So Brent's idea doesn't even hold up going back a couple hundred years. Also, in that post that I shared a minute ago, and I'll share this tab. So this is Jesse Myers, and he's talking about this gene mutation, TKTL1, and how it was perhaps the mutation that allowed us to understand scarcity. And he's major cognitive enhancing changes. And he's saying that maybe this is what allowed us to start money. But money goes back, in my research for this post, money goes back way farther. Bead jewelry has been found as early as 142,000 years ago. But they remain extremely rare before 70,000. Okay, what else? What did I say here? Okay, so here also, if humans had this going back very far into human origins, okay, we have about 1,000 to 1,500 sites, archaeological sites globally. And out of those 1,000 sites, there's only about 10 or 15 that show any symbolic artifacts of any kind. Okay. So if that gene mutation was responsible for our symbolic understanding, then why is it only 1.5% of these sites had any artifacts at all? Now, if we look at Neanderthals, which are considered a separate species, I mean, they are Homo sapien Neanderthal. So they are Homo sapiens, but they're not Homo sapiens sapiens. They're not our subspecies, the modern subspecies. There's about 300 known Neanderthal sites. and 5 to 8 of them contain symbolic artifacts. So they actually have a higher percent. If you go back to this same time, around 70,000 years ago, Neanderthals have a higher percent of symbolic artifacts in their sites. So this isn't even a human thing. Okay, this goes money, and the proto money now goes back before humans. Other species have money, is what this is saying, or at least proto money. And these are actual artifacts. They are not ideas of sovereigns or issuers. No, this is hard money that's being used in some sort of store of value function or status function or something like that. So, no, Brent is completely and utterly wrong here. I don't know how he could be actually more wrong in this particular respect. I do like his stuff on the dollar, but this history stuff is way wrong. And Lynn is doing a good job dismantling it. Like she said, yeah, debt works in small kin groups, small tribes, maybe. But then once you try to trade with your neighboring tribe, that doesn't work so much. Because why would I ever pay you back? You're my rival.
Lynn, would you also say that, sort of going back, predating the sovereign, as you said, sort of Paleolithic origins, they used different forms of money to sort of help with the trade barrier, and maybe the sovereigns also use a form of money, but then maybe to better coordinate the trade within their kingdom. Maybe starting out wanting to help trade in the beginning, maybe moving to more control later when they found out they could debase the currency or something like that.
Yeah, well, there are early technologies that are so basic that we don't consider them technologies today. So it's like bills of exchange on papyrus and then later on paper. Things like coinage. So instead of like sorting out silver dust or something when you're trying to trade with someone, or little chunks of like irregular chunks of silver in exchange for something, anything that kind of unifies or greases the transaction speed ahead of time is useful. So coinage with a preset amount of metal, maybe ridges around the edge to prevent shaving, or some sort of like stamp on it to kind of make it harder to falsely reproduce. These were early technologies, and then later things like the printing press would dramatically reduce the cost of these paper instruments that could be used as proxies. So yeah, a lot of these things developed because they solved actual problems that people had, and then those running a system quickly find that they can game it. They can, make a coin that's 90% gold or silver. But then when they have trouble doing the finances, and they if they tax too much, the people get angry. They don't spend enough, the people get angry, or they want to do a war that's not very popular. Then as they get tax revenue, they can remelt the coins and make them 80% gold or silver, spend more back in. Initially they benefit from the Cantillon effect, so the initial spending, the soldiers' salaries and so forth are still kind of treated the same way. The government basically spends more than they taxed, and then as that increased money circulates more and more, there's supply demand mismatches, and prices start to go up after the government already got their full worth from spending it. And so these kind of exist as error corrections over time. Now there are some times where someone just sets out from the beginning and decides, I'm going to steal people's value secretly. But it usually is a little bit more, I would say, discreet than that, which is a combination of solving a problem, but then using the error correction in your favor, basically.
And again, these early people, what she's talking about here, they weren't using it to manipulate the economy. This was an idea that I'm the issuer, so I'm going to use this to manipulate the economy. They were just using it to make ends meet. Like they were debasing, just simple debasement. They weren't using it to refashion the economy. That wasn't what their idea of control was. They weren't controlling in that way.
Brent, go ahead. What do you have?
Well, again, I think we could probably sit here and talk about this stuff and agree on 90% of it. I think the interesting stuff gets into the 10% where we disagree. And that is that the biggest tool that any government has against their citizens is violence, right? They have a monopoly on violence. That's why it's illegal to, walk up and hit somebody else in the head with a 2x4, right? Now, if they do it, they have a way of justifying it, and it's for the greater good, and they have all these reasonings behind it, but they want to be the monopoly power on that. So that is their number one tool to get the populace to do what they want. And then they tell stories about, we do it on your behalf and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's a power structure. The second biggest tool that they have to get people to do what they want is money. And in some ways, they can provide positive incentives to get people to do what they want. And in other cases, they can impose duties to get what they want. But the idea that the sovereign would, who has a monopoly on violence, would lay down their power to the citizens because the citizens have money of their own, I think that is a little bit of a contradiction if you understand power structures to begin with.
No, you don't understand power structures, Brent. The power structure here is the sovereign wants what the people want. They want the money too. They want this new form of money too. If they have, for example, think of money as a tool. What's another tool? A weapon. Okay, so if you have a better weapon, the sovereign isn't going to use their old weapons to then say nobody can use this new weapon. What is the sovereign going to do? The sovereign is going to use the new weapon in their force projection. So if money is just a tool and someone comes out with better money that works better, that functions better under the specific circumstances that we find ourselves in, the sovereign is just going to adopt the new tool, just going to adopt the new money. See, it's not about control. It's about how much benefit you get from using the tool. And if the people get benefit from using the tool, the sovereign is going to get benefit from using the tool. I just don't think that Brent understands, like he thinks that this is something they can ban. All right. You can't ban Bitcoin. Like you can't ban, like go back 500 years. And the sovereigns really liked the status quo that they had. They had power over their dominions, and they had swords and spears and knights on horses. And then all of a sudden, somebody starts using a musket. And they would say, oh, no. Let's rewrite. No, you guys can't use that. You guys can't use that. We're staying with swords. We're staying with armored knights and maybe some bows and arrows and longbows and stuff. But muskets, no. We can't allow that. No, of course not. They're going to adopt the musket, and it's going to, that is a technological adoption of a new tool. Same with Bitcoin. It's going to be adopted like a new tool. They're not going to just say, no, we're not using it. They're going to use it to maintain their power. It's a neutral tool that anybody can use. All right, let's continue. I just don't understand how he doesn't see that.
Right? If I have the power to walk over and take your gold from you or your Bitcoin from you or whatever it is, why on earth would I stay subservient to you if I didn't like you and you were trying to get me to do something because you had the money and I didn't? So to me, it's very, very hard to separate the two. It's very hard. It's not impossible. And if we had benevolent leaders and altruistic politicians and kings and all these things, it's not that it isn't possible. It just, for me, it doesn't square with reality.
All you have to do is have selfish rulers, and they will adopt the better technology.
And because it doesn't square with reality, and because I think it's very hard to separate money from power, I this is why I fall back on whether something is money or whether it is not money. I fully admit that Bitcoin could be money. Seashells could be money. Gold could be money. But I don't think any of those are right now. They have many qualities that would make them an excellent type of money. And they have many qualities that would be very advantageous to the individual if they were money. But then we get back to the power structure again, is why would those in power want to give an advantage to those they are trying to subject? And it just, I can't get there. I mean, just because I don't think that.
He's completely thinking backwards. Why would the sovereign not adopt something that gives them more power?
I don't think those who give up power remain in power for very long. And those who have ever had power very rarely like to give it up. And so I have a hard time seeing a government instituting or issuing a currency or a money or accepting a money which they cannot control or that they don't have some control over. Now, maybe they don't have to have full control. Maybe they don't have to have a perfect system that they get all the advantages and the individual gets no advantages. But I think if you, on the scales, I think money is always going to advantage the sovereign versus the individual. Now, there's some big advantages to giving some advantages to the individual. If you can convince people that they are working for
Sovereigns are individuals, by the way.
themselves and they are making money for themselves and they get to keep some of the spoils, and as a result, they get to have certain advantages over some of the other citizens, then those people may work harder and provision the government better and all these types of things. And you get into a system which is much more efficient, much more productive. The workers are happier, but it's still a power structure. Even under that scenario, it is still a power structure. And I think if you ever get to a point where the citizens have more power than the government is not going to last very long. Now, the big exception to this rule is the United States of America, right? I don't think people realize when they hear the word,
He's kind of just rambling. He's not even connecting and making sense.
the American experiment or the experiment with democracy, I don't think that people have a proper appreciation for how unique in history this actually was. It's the first time in history that the legal document talking about the government set rules out for what the government could do rather than what the citizens could do. And, a big part of that was money.
That's not true either. The Magna Carta was probably one of the first that said, hey, the sovereign can't do this.
Right. And that's why initially there wasn't a fiat currency in the U.S. And so I'm probably just kind of rambling here at this point, but to me, it's very important to get the point across that it's not that we can't have a great system where money benefits the individual. It's not that we've never had one, but I think the idea that we are going to have a fully functioning government and a money that works for the people rather than the government is a beautiful, beautiful dream. But I just have a hard time seeing it implemented in reality.
See, the main problem, I think, and Fuzzy Bear, yeah, he's rambling. The main problem here is that he sees that these at cross purposes. Okay, again, it's a tool, just like a musket, all right? Or the printing press, we could say the printing press. And there were wars. I mean, the printing press wasn't very liked by the sovereigns at the beginning. But now, man, they sure do use the media for their propaganda, right? So it's just a tool. And a sovereign that doesn't want to adopt the musket is not long for this world. The same way as a sovereign that doesn't want to adopt Bitcoin isn't long for this world. You will fall behind. You will become weak relative to your neighbors, and you will be dominated. And the elites will lose. So the elites, their self-interest is to adopt Bitcoin. And we're seeing that playing out right now. And I don't know how Brent does not see that. They benefit from adopting Bitcoin, even if they're late. So one thing that I've been reading about on Twitter is talking about the HODL waves and, the 80,000 Bitcoins that were recently liquidated out of long-term cold storage, and how there's always turnover. Okay, there is always turnover. And it's very, very hard to hold long-term. Very, very hard to hold for any length of time, like 20 years or something like that, because you want to realize your gains. And yes, maybe the Matrix meme of Morpheus and Neo, and he says, so you're saying that one day I can sell Bitcoin for $1 million, and he's saying, no, one day you won't have to. That's true too. You can hodl long enough that it is going to be fully adopted. But that's extremely hard. I mean, I deal with this, and I have talks with my wife about this, about cold storage Bitcoin and using it to better our lives while we're still young and we still have kids in the house, and we can better our kids' life and our kids' experiences in life versus hodling, right? And so it's very hard to not realize your gains. Why was I saying that? About the turnover. Okay, so even if the sovereigns are late to the game, there's going to be a lot of turnover, and they are such big buyers, it's hard to comprehend. So think about even a very wealthy individual, say they're worth $100 million or $500 million, and they are going to buy, they have the ability to buy a couple $1,000,000 worth of Bitcoin right off the bat. Maybe they can do $10 million worth of Bitcoin. That's their liquid assets that they can put into Bitcoin. And the government, okay, so that's a lot of Bitcoin. But the government can come in and can spend hundreds of billions of dollars, the US government at least, billions, 10,000 times more than a wealthy individual. So even if they're late, the government can still buy a very significant amount of Bitcoin and still maintain their status with the turnover of early Bitcoiners selling, like that 80,000 Bitcoins that just were sold. So yeah, this is not like they're late. It's not like they can't get in. Bitcoin aligns incentives. You are better off buying Bitcoin, just like you're better off adopting firearms when they were invented. You were better off adopting all of these other technologies when they are invented. You're better off adopting Bitcoin. So no, he's saying that there's cross purposes here, but there's not. They have the same incentives that we have. They're operating under the exact same incentives as everybody else. Dex Invictus, long-term holding is an insane gainer, is stupid hard. Yeah, it is. It is. Well, that's what most people don't like, that meme. You guys, I'm sure, have seen that meme of what hodling is really like versus what people think it's like. And there's the top is a stick man, and he's riding up a gentle slope to the finish line. And that's what people think hodling is like. But what hodling really is like is there's all these dips, and there's shark infested water. There's a tightrope. There's fire you have to walk through. It's like, and that's what hodling is like. It's an emotional roller coaster. It's very, very hard to hold long term. I mean, I've been holding for a long time, and it is very hard. I haven't held all my Bitcoin, but it's very, very, very hard to hold over long periods of time. Okay, let's see if there's anything on Telegram. No. How many people are still on Telegram? There's a few of you guys. Okay, let's go a little bit more. Not going to watch the whole thing. I said I wasn't going to interrupt very much, but you know me, I had to do it. So, all right.
I want to pass that to Lynn, obviously, but just to summarize that. So the problem that you see is potentially maybe we've had the free money in the past. The governments now have control of it. And number one, you see a hard time where they would ever give up control. They have a monopoly on violence, so what they would do almost anything to maintain that control. And then potentially, even if they were able to lose control, we see governments lose.
Fuzzy Bear says, institutions make people think it's too hard to custody their own Bitcoin, yet they will provide services and incentives to hold it for you. That should tell you everything. Very true. Very true. Yeah, that's a whole nother topic that we can get into on another live stream, but I think it's important to self-custody, but at the same time, I think most people won't self-custody. Just like if you think back previously, even before Bitcoin, I was a gold bug, and very few people owned gold and silver physically. And yeah, when it was used as a medium of exchange, sure, some people used silver coins because we had silver in the coins, in the quarters and dimes and nickels and stuff. But very few people held gold in their house or self-custody of their wealth. They would hold it in a bank, and they would use paper money. And even today, nobody really will self-custody very few will self-custody Bitcoin in the future. Very few people will have any significant amount of Bitcoin anyway. Like if you think about in the US, there's a high percentage of people that can't meet an emergency of, I don't know, like $2,000. They don't have $2,000 in savings. So that's a high percentage of people. Maybe 70% of the US, I can't remember the exact statistic, but 70% of people in the US can't meet a $2,000 emergency. They don't have the savings. So how are they going to go from that to having all of this Bitcoin savings? They're not. They're not. So most people won't even have they won't even have the economic capacity to own a lot of Bitcoin. And in that case, like self-custodying $2,000 in Bitcoin is different than self-custodying, say, $200,000 in Bitcoin, right? So there's less incentive to self-custody a smaller amount. But anyway, we could do a whole show on that, but let's keep going.
Control over their money quite regularly. If they were to lose control over that, they would probably enact another system to take control back again.
Yeah, that perfect.
And Lynn, you might say that the technology might have changed that. I think that's what you argued earlier. So go ahead and see what you say about that.
I would argue that shifting technology changes where the power lies, or maybe more specifically, how much power is concentrated, because there's certain asymmetries that form and then go away. So we can examine those claims kind of around the margins. One is that there are existence of small.
This is too nuanced. Brent's wrong because the sovereigns they benefit from adopting the new technology. Plain and simple. You don't have to go through and say at the margins and it's happening in this place and that place and for technology changes. And of course, technology changes. That's what we're talking about. Sovereigns have a benefit from adopting the new technology. That's better. If there's some new technology is broken, like quantum computers, like they're not incentivized to maybe put all of this R&D into some potential breakthrough technology. But once the technology is proven, they have incentive to adopt that technology. We don't have to go into all the minutia.
Smaller countries, they get dollarized. So basically their currency is either one so mismanaged that basically people have no choice but to default to something else. And the government really kind of loses its ability to say, stop using other monies, only use our monies because it's so unworkable. Or in some cases, there are politicians that come up and say, we managed the currency so bad, we're just going to stick with basically the dollar or whatever the case may be. And so around the margins, there are already places that do that. And then there are even wealthy countries. I mean, there are certain parts of Switzerland that accept Bitcoin as tax, for example. You can pay your taxes with it, and otherwise it's endorsed. So around the margins, we know that while it is true that most governments will do their best to impose a currency, it's not unheard of for it not to be the case. In addition, we exist right now in like a 54-year period of global fiat currency. And so before then, there was some sort of tether to precious metals, mainly gold. And we don't know what the future is going to look like another 54 years from now. So this experiment that we currently exist in is still relatively new. And of course, every generation kind of reorients around the current reality. So now it's like, well, how could countries not entirely have their own currency? That's just how things are now. I mean, almost every single country has one. And even countries that don't have one, the handful of them use some other countries, larger countries, fiat currency. But again, that's we exist in this 150-year kind of speed mismatch where the telecom era that totally reset the board, and then really only in the past third of that century and a half era, so really the past 50 years, have we entered the full-on kind of ramifications of that era, which is the fiat currency era that we currently have now, where even when a currency fails, people rarely fall back to gold because gold is so slow and has all these divisibility issues, so they generally fall back ironically to a larger fiat currency that's still functioning. And another thing that's worth pointing out is, I mean, you can go on Twitter and find all these debates where they would say if Bitcoin gets big enough, the governments are going to ban it. And of course, there have been some governments that either try to ban it or restrict it or surveil it. It's still very popular, to even ones that have allowed it. And yet it's important to remember that government is not a monolith, at least in most cases, as long as you're not in North Korea or some other cases. Generally speaking, the places we're talking about, government is not a monolith. Every generation or so, there's rotations that occur. There's while not everyone has the divisions of power that America has, many countries have some degree of divisions of power, either independent courts or multiple legislative bodies, and basically limits on any sort of centralized power. In addition, power is generally easier to wield when you get the public, at least mostly on your side. It's kind of like plausible deniability. Whereas it's hard to do when you fully take the mask off and to say we're against the people now. It's often, for example, power is often taken in moments of fear, where you promise people security in exchange for some of their freedom. Or you say, we talked about earlier, we're solving a problem for you. Hey, sometimes you don't solve that problem perfectly, but we're only human, and we're just kind of grifting off the side of it while we do it. But people still generally believe that things are being operated better than if there was no one. Whereas if you just come to them and say, we're going to reduce your freedoms because we want to, or because it's in our interest, that's when you're more likely to get widespread protests and things like that. And so one of the things that Bitcoin does is it's basically a decentralized Excel spreadsheet, more or less. It's backed up by various forms of distributed consensus that allow that to function for so long. And governments have now grappled with this thing for 16 years. People said that they'd ban it. Again, some have. But now we have a president, for example, that in his first term was pretty opposed to it. Now he, endorses it. Maybe he's not fully philosophically aligned with Bitcoin proponents around the world, but he's kind of recognized the usefulness of it. I think there's pretty clear game theory here, where like people that were in kind of the Elizabeth Warren camp, that were kind of basing their identities or their brand around being anti-crypto or anti-Bitcoin. There's no money in that, whereas there's more money in supporting the candidates that would at least allow marginal freedom to keep interacting with it. In addition, and this is my last point for this kind of part. When we back up, there's like this global chessboard where even when politicians in a country are trying to pose things locally, they're still competing with other regions. And again, if you're not North Korea, then there's some degree of like mobility going on in most cases. Capital often doesn't want to go to places where capital is not respected. Brain drain happens where people that have capability or means try to leave places that are not conducive for them, and that other places are happy to have because they can benefit their economy. And so in a lot of countries, it's in their best interest to say, we're still going to have our own currency as far as we can get away with it. We're going to try to surveil things to some extent, but we're not just going to go fully mask off and just, kind of impose arbitrary restrictions, because we want to be seen as a reasonable actor on the global stage where capital and people want to be. And Bitcoin benefits from that kind of global arbitrage that happens, where if one place decides to, get all authoritarian, another place and say, well, we're gonna, allow more freedom. And there's already hubs around the world where it's been endorsed in some capacity. And they ebb and flow over time, but there's plenty of footholds. And then, we've already seen this for decades with the dollar, which is that the dollar finds its way into all these different little currency monopolies. The leaders aren't always thrilled about it, but there's generally only so much they can do without going 100% mask off. And if they go 100% mask off, they often start losing, the support of the people, which gets hard to maintain longer term.
Boom, mic drop. Yeah, she was saying, pretty much reiterated what I've said so far. I like she touched on a 54-year experiment. She's talking since 1971, and I do agree with that. I often say a 75-year credit bubble, because really the credit-based system goes back before 1971, and 1971 was just the final, I guess, admission that we were on a credit-based system and not on a gold-based system anymore. So you can go back further than 1971, but at least she's saying it's a 54-year experiment. And yes, my whole thesis is built around this credit-based experiment. So when she says the fiat era, she's wrong. Okay, that's not fiat money; it's credit-based money. Even Mises, had fiat, commodity, and credit money as different things, and we have credit money now. So we're in a credit money era, and we're at the end of a credit money era. So it's a big boom for the first 90% of that, and now we're on the tail end. Since the great financial crisis, we're on a diminishing marginal return era at the end of a credit-based system, where growth will be very rare. Growth and inflation will be very rare. And you'll just get a grinding lower and lower. You add into that demographics. That's one thing that she didn't touch on there, is demographics as well. So money will flee from the places with the worst demographics, money and people. The top 1% aren't going to stay in a place where their economy is being crushed by the old people. And so they will flee. The top 1% will flee from those places along with their capital and their potential capital in the future, their potential wealth. So also she said that it's based off of the support of the people. And that's true. I mean, once again, Mark or Brent doesn't seem to be understanding history or knowing much about history. But even going back to the Roman times, we wouldn't call Rome any sort of democracy, at least the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic maybe was partially somewhat a representative republic, with the elites being able to vote, but the empire was in no way, shape, or form any sort of democracy. It was very authoritarian. Yet even then, they had to appease the plebs. They had to appease the people with bread and circuses, right? That's where the whole idea of bread and circuses came. The whole saying came from. So you had to get the support of the people, and you still do. You still do. Even if you're doing trickeration on them, even if you're doing propaganda, you still have to get that support of the people, or like Lynn says, you'll have protests and people will flee, capital will flee. You can't do mask off, like she said. That's a great way to describe it. They can't do what Brent is saying and go full bore authoritarian, because they will lose power. And even in the short term, if they don't lose power, like say North Korea, I would say that North Korea is not a place where, one, people would stay if they could leave. But also, like, if we're really in this geopolitical chessboard, okay, take away any sort of nuclear weapons that North Korea has. If they're just a poor country, and they wouldn't be able to stand up to their rivals if those rivals actually wanted to take them over. So your elites are restricted by how mask off they can be by this international chessboard, and your neighbors and your rivals and who wants to do you harm. And so, yeah, you have to have some level of support from the people, popular support. And again, it just comes back to the idea of it being a technology and a tool, and the sovereigns have every incentive to adopt a better tool. They have no incentive to stop, to ban. At least maybe very nearsighted or short-sighted authoritarians have incentive to ban. But if they knew the real game theory going on, they don't have that incentive to ban. They have the incentive to adopt the currency or the new tool. Okay.
Yeah, great point. So, Brent, you used a historical narrative, and Lynn says that technology changes things. And so now we have this technology. And to your point about the dollar sort of finding its way into these countries.
No, not just the technology changes things. History doesn't agree with Brent.
You add in the US dollar stablecoin, which is a new technology to empower the dollar. It's finding its way in even further now. Do you have any points to counter on that, or we can go to the next one?
No, a couple of things. And again, Lynn makes great points. One point I would add on to what she said, because I don't disagree with what she said, is that part of the reason, in my opinion, that governments have not come out and forcefully challenged Bitcoin in a big way is because so far Bitcoin has not challenged the sovereignty of the dollar or most other fiat currencies. I think this is probably the point where we started to disagree on the Twitter exchange. Was, in my opinion, and I think you guys disagree with me on this, is that Bitcoin has changed its narrative from a medium of exchange to a store of value. And I think it is because of that narrative change, and because it's not widely used.
What? Bitcoin is some monolithic thing with a narrative that it pushes? No, it's just people and understanding. But we had this idea for a very long time. You can go back to gold bugs, like pre-Bitcoin, right? That the idea was that first it would be a store of value, a new money would be a store of value, then it would become a medium of exchange, a limited medium of exchange, until it hit a tipping point, and then everyone would be using it, and it would become a unit of account. So there is a monetization path, and the realization of the monetization path is what people have come to understand. It is along the same lines as when I say don't spend your Bitcoin, because And people say, "Oh, we need a circular economy within Bitcoin. We need to use it as a medium of exchange." No, you first is adopted. Think about this: a medium of exchange. What are you exchanging? You're exchanging value, right? So first, you have to accrue the value, and you don't have to have a full accrual of value in the monetization to start using it as a medium of exchange. But you have to, like, if it's going to double every 2 years, say, or every year, even maybe let's say every 2 years it doubles, are you going to spend it? Probably not. So first comes the accrual of value, and then comes the exchange of that value, the medium of exchange. And so just obviously in a monetization path, you have to start with store value. And Bitcoin's narrative didn't change, Brent. Bitcoin's narrative didn't change. People were talking about that exact same thing, gosh, at least 2016. Probably my whole time in Bitcoin. Going back to 2014, people were talking about store value versus medium of exchange. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. But where his attention is, has changed. Perhaps his understanding of Bitcoin has changed, but Bitcoin itself has not changed.
As a medium of exchange, it is used. There are places you can use it. And if you're really creative and thoughtful and plan out ahead, you can use it in many different places. But Bitcoin is not a widely accepted general medium of exchange. If it was, then I think the government, not only the United States, but governments of the rest of the world, would have a bigger problem with it. But as it is now, it's an asset. And it's an asset that has gone up in price a lot. And as a result, it's created a tremendous amount of wealth. And it's generated a lot of technological innovation around that space. And some of that technological innovation around that space, I would argue, is being adopted by the United States government to even further cement the US dollar as the global reserve currency rather than have it challenged. So I don't know if you want to come back to that or not, but that would be the points I would make on Lynn's comments.
So he's talking about the stablecoin bill and Tether and that kind of stuff. Yeah, but Bitcoin does not really compete with the dollar, because the dollar can be backed by Bitcoin. Like, think about when the dollar was a gold standard. Did the dollar compete against gold? No. The dollar was gold. Didn't compete against gold. So ultimately, the dollar won't compete with gold. Ultimately compete with Bitcoin. The dollar will be Bitcoin. It'll be denominated in Bitcoin. Or Bitcoin will be denominated in dollars. And whether they set that at a sat per dollar, or maybe 100 sats per dollar, something like that, or 10 sats, that's what it's going to be. So ultimately, it does not compete with the dollar. So Brent's wrong on that again.
I would say that Bitcoin didn't change its narrative. I mean, from the beginning, there were people pointing out its store value properties and its medium of exchange properties. It's been used as both from the beginning. I actually had a recent article on this, which is to say that people often they separate, again, this is time dependent. So they'll say, because in its first 16 years of existence, literally bootstrapping from zero up to now a $2+ trillion asset, to say it's not money because it's not ubiquitous exchange. Well, in the global sense, in order for it to be ubiquitous exchange, it'd have to be like 10 times bigger than it is now. It's a $2 trillion asset. And one of the points I made in our Twitter thread, was
that's exactly what I said. You have to accrue the value first.
Already better portable liquid capital than, I would say 170 out of the 180 fiat currencies out there, right? So the Egyptian pound is worse money in New Jersey, I would say, than Bitcoin is, meaning that it's harder for me to spend Egyptian pounds than Bitcoin. And that's not just because Egypt is a developing country, because it's similarly hard for me to spend Norwegian currency in New Jersey. It happens to be a small, wealthy country, no network effect that extends here. And so when you think of assets you could bring globally that have monetary aspects, Bitcoin is very high in the list. Physical dollars are high in the list. Gold coins or silver coins are high in the list. Bitcoin's high in the list. A couple other currencies like euros or pounds are reasonably high in the list, and it drops off really quickly after that. There are certain assets like a Monet painting or even Apple stock that have virtually no utility as money, either because they lack the visibility and liquidity in a painting's case, or as Apple stock, it's very hard to actually give it to someone else until ironically it's tokenized in a more recent time period. But before tokenization, there's no way to transfer Apple stock to someone else, and even then, it would have all sorts of frictions, and it would rely on a chain of credit. And now we exist in a time where there's a spectrum of how much monetary aspect something has. So something that's like a painting has basically zero monetary value other than it's a liquid store of value that can be self-custodied. Company stock is also not very monetized. Real estate's not very monetized in the sense that there's very little capability to actually use that to exchange value. But when you go toward things like silver coins, gold coins, or Bitcoin, then it starts having pretty significant monetary properties. And even though there's no country where there's enough density, like a top-down monopoly, so far, at least in the first 16 years, it still ranks pretty high globally for places you could use it. And I mean, I'm not sure if I assume Mark has bought and sold things in Bitcoin. I have. There's multiple countries where I've bought things using Bitcoin, and in addition, to avoid the irony, I sell broken money in Bitcoin, at least as one of my distributor options, to avoid the joke that you only sell broken money for broken money. So we've had significant sales globally of my book in Bitcoin. There's not been really any requests for people to buy it in gold or silver, and there's really obviously it's hard to do that online. There's some credit ways to do it, but there was demand and requests for people that want to buy it in Bitcoin, so we met that. And then when I receive that Bitcoin, I hold it. It's not something I immediately sell for something else. I hold it, and so we can debate like philosophically what is money, but the few things that I've used in my life for money are one, fiat currencies because I'm born in this era, and two, Bitcoin.
Well,
I want to give Brent a chance because I know this is the
mic drop. Oh man, she is just undefeated. Is Brent tired of losing here? I mean, this is really, really bad showing for Brent, and I feel bad for him because I like his dollar stuff. I like his milkshake theory. It was formative for me. Going back, I've told this story many times, but going back to when I first learned about the credit-based system, not being fiat, being credit-based, and how the dollar system actually works and why it won't hyperinflate, it'll actually deflate. The first most important person was Jeff Schneider, and he is not a Bitcoiner. He's a blockchainer. He thinks the technology is something special, but the Bitcoin itself is not special because he loves elasticity. And Brett Johnson was perhaps maybe the second most influential person on my thinking way back. I'm talking like 2015, 2016, something like that. I'm not sure exactly when he had that, his first presentation of it. But that was formative on me as well. But he's not a Bitcoiner. So it's very interesting that I hold these opinions, or I hold these this understanding. I have this understanding of the system, but I'm also a Bitcoiner. And how do you square that? And I think I've done a decent job of squaring that over the years. But he's just losing badly here. Badly. Lynn Alden, coming off the top rope, point after point after point, dead to rights on this. I mean, she is absolutely correct. I love that point. And I don't know if I heard her say it before. I've heard someone say it before that, if you can't spend reals, Brazilian reals in Texas, right? But you can't spend Bitcoin, and you can spend Bitcoin in certain places in Brazil and globally. So if you're talking about global acceptance of a currency, of a money, Bitcoin is right up there. It's higher than gold today. Like, you couldn't take a gold coin and go buy a sandwich or something, but you could, like a steak and shake, but you can go take Bitcoin and buy that, right? So Bitcoin is more accepted than gold, and gold has 10 times the market cap. Something's wrong there, and that's going to be corrected. But that is a very, very good point that she brought up, and she brought up so many points there I can't even go through them all. But Yeah, let's see if Brent can respond with anything at all that's a logical argument.
Disagreement part. I do want to just say last summer I did take my family over to Europe, and we spent about a month going through Italy and Greece. And as I walked around all the streets there in all the major cities, and as walking by all the money changers that are there, lots of them had Bitcoin listed along with the other currencies that they convert. So I didn't see gold accepted there, but I did see Bitcoin acceptable for the other currency exchanges. But anyway,
So,
go ahead.
yeah. Well, so Mike, I guess this is a question maybe for each of you is, because this is the part I don't quite get. And by the way, I have this same conversation with my friends in the gold world. So this is not exclusive to Bitcoin. But why is it so important for Bitcoin to be considered money? Why can't it just be a highly liquid, globally accepted asset? What is the strong affinity and almost to me, when I say Bitcoin isn't money, the amount of
Okay, this goes to part of his own opening when he was saying, I am not concerned with what I want it to be. I'm not being prescriptive. I'm being descriptive. So Bitcoiners, when they say Bitcoin is money, they're not being prescriptive. They're being descriptive. They're saying its monetary properties are such that it's going to be adopted as money. And it is money. It does serve as money today, but it's going to be adopted globally as money. That's a descriptive claim. That's not a prescriptive claim. And Brent opened saying that that's what he is worried about. And now here he's backing up. He's backing into this emotional defensive state by projecting onto Bitcoiners something that's not happening. Okay, that he's doing.
people that come after me so zealously is something to behold. And I don't quite understand why, because something doesn't have to be money in order to be an incredibly valuable asset. So what is I don't want to call it obsession because that'll probably trigger people, but what is it that do you think the industry so much wants Bitcoin to be considered money? I would actually argue it would be better for the industry if you guys didn't advertise it as money and just advertised it as a store of value or an asset, because then you're going to be less likely to run into regulatory hurdles or challenges from legal authorities. So,
well, there he's about 16 years behind Satoshi, because Satoshi didn't want it to be donated to WikiLeaks because he thought it would be coming up on the radar of the powerful people that early on and be able to be somewhat stopped in the very initial stages. So, he's just saying an argument that's well tread in Bitcoin.
This is a question for me. Like, what is it about it needing to be money that you think is so ubiquitous within the industry?
But also, what kind of question is that? What does it matter? We're being descriptive.
Industry.
Well, there are some Bitcoin proponents that use that same line of reasoning and say we shouldn't call it money, we should call it something else. And there are other Bitcoin proponents that would disagree with them. I think that it's important to separate whether or not something has the functionality of money versus whether or not it's currently used widely as money at the current time. So, for example, fine art, even regardless of whether people are using it as money, there's no world where it could be used as money, at least without abstraction and credit, things like that. It just the physical properties aren't there. There's a reason why gold and silver evolved as money, and most other things did not, because they actually have intrinsic attributes that make them better monies than other things. And so Bitcoin was, first of all, it was designed to have monetary aspects, and two, it does have monetary aspects. Now, again, it's bootstrapping from literally zero. There's no top-down enforcement in the world to make people do it as money. So it's just.
She should throw it back in his face and say, dude, you started this whole thing by saying you want to be descriptive of what things really are. And now you're saying you have a problem with you're saying that Bitcoiners are being prescriptive. We're not. We're being descriptive too. You just don't agree. But that is the way it is. That's the facts.
Purely cross-border kind of global thing that competes with those other top monies as kind of portable capital. I've generally argued that medium of exchange usage, at least at a wide scale, would take a very long time, and that right now, basically what it is portable capital for the most of its value, which is to say it's capital that you can hold, that's liquid, rather fungible, and that you can pretty safely self-custody and bring globally in many aspects, which is a very novel aspect. And then you can find ways in those jurisdictions. You can't always buy your burrito with it, but you can usually find someone to exchange with you with liquid capacity, and then go out and buy the burrito, whatever the local casino token is for that particular jurisdiction. Because that's kind of what fiat currencies are. They're these little tokens that are issued by the local authority. Now, but because Bitcoin has these attributes,
that's not what our money is. Our money is credit-based money. It's printed in the process of making a loan. It's not even printed by the sovereign.
Actually also can directly be used as money, which is harder for gold and silver in the modern time. And so I think one is people argue that it has the physical capability to be used as money. There's the base layer, there's Lightning on top of it, there's Chalming eCash now that's built on top of that. Of course, people can also exchange, collateralized credit representing Bitcoin if they want to. There's this kind of full stack ecosystem that allows it to be used as money in various forms. But again, it's up against a very strong network effect. And then, often the Venn diagram of people saying it's not money and people saying that it has no value or shouldn't be held, there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. Not 100%, because again, there are people that like Bitcoin as an investment that don't like to call it as money, or either philosophically don't believe it or think it's more convenient not to label it like that. But often the claim that it's not good money is used by people saying that it has no value. They're saying, well, why not use something else to store value? Why not do other this? Because Bitcoin's failing in that one regard. But I would point out, Bitcoin is the most liquid, divisible, fungible asset that you can bring with you globally at scale, which is much harder to do with other investments, much harder to do even with physical currencies or precious metals of other types. And so it has these monetary aspects. And over time, it can get, as it gets larger and more understood and more liquid and more ubiquitous.
I mean, you can do that with the dollar, but there is censorship where Bitcoin is censorship resistant.
It can keep inching up.
So I would agree with all of that. And again, if that's the way it was generally presented with the
if you agree with all that, what's your point?
People I interact with, I would accept that. But
we can't speak. We can't speak for everybody here.
No, I know, but you guys know what I'm talking about as well. I mean, just go back to our thread and look at it. If someone were to say Bitcoin is a fantastic asset, it's portable, it's liquid, it's why it's been a fantastic store of value, and I think one day it has the potential to become money, I probably wouldn't argue a whole lot, right? Other than
what would you say? Brent? What would you say the definition of money is, and where Bitcoin fails? And even though, as Lynn pointed out, is
oh my God, it took them. How long have they been talking here? 42 minutes to even ask that question. Come on now.
Has all the right attributes and is on that evolutionary path. You seem to think it's short of. So what is your definition, and where does Bitcoin fall short there?
Yeah, so first of all, I will say I think it is on the evolutionary path, but I'm on the evolutionary path to being a very good-looking older gentleman, but I'm just not there yet, right? So it's just so it's not that it can't be, it's just that it's not. And so what I would say money was is that money is the most marketable commodity and the extinguisher of debt. And I don't think that Bitcoin is the most marketable commodity, and I don't think it extinguishes debt. Now, if you happen to borrow Bitcoin from somebody and you return it to them and that extinguishes that debt, then perhaps it can.
I would change that definition a little bit, and I would say it is a marketable commodity and a extinguisher of debt. And debt in this case would have to be denominated in that commodity, right? So you'd have to have Bitcoin denominated debt for Bitcoin to extinguish, but a commodity. It doesn't have to be the most marketable commodity, because I don't think he would say the dollar is a commodity right now, right? So that doesn't even fit his definition of the dollar. So what? If he had time to think about it, he'd probably come up with a better definition, but that doesn't even fit his definition of the dollar. So anyway, let's keep going.
Be the extinguisher of debt, but it's not a widely accepted extinguisher of debt. And this kind of gets back to my original point that money is very often, and in my opinion, almost inseparable, not impossible, very close, very, very, very hard to separate from the state or the imposition of the state, right? And the way that you extinguish your obligation.
Well, Lynn already talked about this, that other countries have gotten rid of their currency and use a dollar. Other countries accept Bitcoin for payment of taxes. States in the United States accept Bitcoin for the payment of taxes. So that argument is he's saying it's very hard, but just because it hasn't happened that much, not because it's very hard, but because the game theory hasn't lined up perfectly yet. And Lynn, has said, "Oh, it's been only 16 years." Yeah, it's a very nascent money, but that doesn't mean it's very hard to change the money or whatever. I mean, history is replete with changing of money and changing of currencies and doing all that. In one of these posts, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, it's this one here. So this is the evolution of the global reserve money, an infographic. I wrote this back in November last year. And it goes on River. They have this infographic that was very, very well done. And you can see global reserve asset is up here. This is the money on the top. Okay. This is the money. And this is a currency. So currency is different than money. Currency is a denomination of the money. So like on a gold standard, gold is the money, and the Spanish real, which that isn't true here. Actually, this should be silver up above this one and above the Dutch guilder. This should be silver. But anyway, I like it because it separates the money, the asset, from the currency, the denomination of the asset. Okay, but then I come down here and I talk about this one here. So I say a Bitcoin dollar. As you can see on my graph above, the dollar has gone through several versions just since becoming a rival for global reserve currency 100 years ago. So if you go back up here, these are major reserve currencies. The florin and ducat, then into the Spanish real, into the British pound, and then different versions of the US dollar. You have the gold dollar, Bretton Woods dollar, euro dollar. Those three different versions. And that's all happened in the last 100 years. The term euro dollar is synonymous with what I call credit-based money today. It is a failing experiment, and it should be an honest observer's base case that the dollar will change once again, this time back to sound money. So the base case is the dollar will change because the dollar has always changed and currency has always changed. And even what is money has always changed. So if we go back up here, like I said, the Spanish real was a silver standard. The Dutch guilder was really kind of a minor adjustment to the Spanish real because the Dutch still used the real in their trading empire. They tried to change it to the guilder, but really it wasn't being accepted in China and other places. So the Dutch really used the real in their trading empire, but they had their own form of the real, and that was the guilder. So this is kind of one standard, but it was silver. Okay. So that does change. So if you're going in the future and you're saying, oh, is money going to change? Hell yeah, money is going to change. That is your base case that money is going to change. All right. So this is the history of the dollar. Brief history. And look how many times it's changed. Let's go through these. 1792 was the Coinage Act. It sets par with Spanish silver dollar, this many grains per dollar of silver. Then approximately, 40 years later, there's the Coinage Act, and it sets $1 to a slightly different amount of silver, okay, and gold. So it went from a silver standard to a silver and gold standard in 1834. Then you had approximately 40 years later again, the Coinage Act, where they demonetized silver. This is when we entered the classical gold standard, where we got rid of the silver and it was just gold. Then 30 years later, we had the Gold Standard Act, and that codified the de facto gold standard at 25.8 grains of 90% gold. So different amount of grains because it's a different purity. This is probably 100%. This is 90%. Different amount of grains, but the dollar changed in 1900. 30 years later, Roosevelt's gold program, Executive Order 6102, and they changed it to $35 an ounce. So again, another change 30 years later. Then only 11 years later, they had the Bretton Woods that maintained $35 an ounce, but changed a bunch of the financial system with the pegs to other currencies. In the 50s and 70s, the rise of the Eurodollar system. 1971, the Nixon shock ends gold redeemability. And now we're going to change again. The dollar is going to change again. This should be the observer's base case, that the dollar will change. The dollar is not a monolithic, unchanging thing. In fact, today we are living through the longest period in U.S. history without a revision to what the dollar is. It is a safe assumption that the dollar will evolve again. Right now, it is moving in the direction of Bitcoin. So, yeah, I wrote that 6 months ago or whatever. Let's get back into this. We're probably not going to watch the whole thing, but let's watch a few more minutes.
To the state, whether you like it or not, is to pay them their tribute or their tax or however you want to define that.
Oh, before we do this, some people were saying Bitcoin is moving. Oh, buddy, we get some Sunday open. Is CME? When did they open? Yep, they just opened. Look at that big gap up on CME. Big gap up here on CME. We'll probably close that, but we broke out of that line that I was showing you at the beginning of the stream. We're breaking out of that right now. Strong move for Bitcoin. Okay, cool. Let's get back to this.
Now, Lynn pointed out a rather unique possibility to do this in a certain place in Switzerland. I'm sure she's correct, but that's not a widely accepted way to extinguish your debt to the state, right? And if it was, then I would probably be much closer to accepting Bitcoin as money. And again, to me,
well, right now you can hold it and then you can liquidate it right before you pay your taxes, right? So it's a medium of exchange kind of right now. It's a clunky one because they don't accept it, but it's very, very quick to accept it if you just make simple changes to the law. Like I said, there's U.S. states that accept it. I think Ohio accepts it. Maybe Texas and Tennessee, I'm not sure, but certain states do accept it for payment of taxes. I do not recommend paying your taxes in Bitcoin, but you can just hold it and then liquidate it right before you pay your taxes. So that is one way to do it as well. So again, Brent's, he technically is right, but he's not right in the spirit of what he's saying.
It's like saying, a racehorse is a fantastic asset, but it's not a Ferrari, right? It's just not. There is a difference, and I don't understand why it has to be considered money. I don't see. I still, and by the way, and let's go back to gold on this too. I don't understand the people in the gold world, their obsession with saying that gold is money, because in a perfect utopian society where there was no government and it was, again, everybody enters into free exchange, I think gold would make a fantastic form of money, and I think it very likely would be money. But I just don't think that's the world we live in. Again, it would be like me saying, I have a 50-inch vertical jump. But when my son asks me why I can't dunk the basketball, I say, well, we just haven't moved to the moon yet, right? When we're on the moon, then I'm going to be able to dunk pretty easily. But that's just not the way it is. And so, maybe we're talking semantics here, but
that's just not the way it is. What? I mean, that's like looking at an acorn and saying it can't, it's not, well, not an acorn. Looking at a small tree and saying that's not a tree because a tree is really tall and that thing is just a sprout. It just sprouted. It's only 6 inches tall. That's not a tree. Trees are 10 feet tall. No, it is a tree. You're defining it wrong. Okay. He said that money is a commodity. And just now, he just said that. But he thinks the dollar is money. And the dollar is not a commodity. It's money.
I just don't understand why. I think I do understand it. I think it's because people are rebelling against sovereign rule, right?
I would say,
especially with the state of the world. And so they just don't want to accept it.
I think it just falls down to semantics. As Lynn made the case, it has the money attributes as you've accepted. There's this evolutionary path. It's pretty much there. And it really comes down to a couple of nitpicky things. And I would say, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Bitcoin community, as you're saying, but I think it just fits our definition of money. And so we say that. I think most Bitcoiners don't really care what the government thinks about it. That's the whole point we have Bitcoin. So we're not looking for any official definition.
Well, they used to not, but now they do.
Right. I want to move on to be respectful of everybody's time here. I have one more topic that I want to get through, and that is the last topic is about the difference or maybe the competition or the fight over individual freedom versus systemic stability. And so I think one of the things that you think.
Well, he said that, just a quick thing there on what he said at the end, kind of making fun, saying, "Oh, they didn't at the beginning, but now they do." Well, no, we don't really care. We're being descriptive, not prescriptive, as Brent would say. That the government, it's understandable that sometimes at the very early stages, you expect them to fight you. But what's the end of that saying? They will join you. Right. So we're in the process of being done with the fighting and joining us. And we understand that this is a process. Anyway.
There, Brent, is that, the dollar is part of that systemic liberty. And you've made the case that it's sort of against maybe best interest of the individual. And so we have to sort of balance that. And I think Lynn would argue in Broken Money that the store of money is one of freedom, or the story of money, I should say, is one of freedom versus control. But then, Brent, you're saying that governments use the dollar for stability and control. So, Brent, maybe you want to explain your side of that balance of freedom versus systemic stability?
Yeah, I think if you look back across all of history, the times where individuals had
oh boy, all history, Brent,
freedom to do what they wanted was a pretty small subset of that overall timeline. It's not that freedoms didn't exist and there wasn't some degree of freedom. But I would argue that the last 50, 60, 100 years has warped our understanding of what.
Look, if you go back very far, people didn't understand the concept of freedom that we have today because they were just trying to stay alive. They probably thought freedom was not dying. Okay. It's like Jordan Peterson, one of the things that he said in one of his interviews where they're talking about male versus female, and that men had rights and women didn't have rights or whatever. And he was like, if you go back just 100 years, the history of humanity is not men fighting women or men trying to keep women down. It's everybody being stuck in the shit together. Right. So, yeah, there wasn't some concept of freedom the way we think of freedom today, of the inability maybe of or like inalienable rights. That term inalienable rights, I don't know if it was used before the Declaration of Independence, but that might have been the first time it was ever used. So there was not even a concept of freedom the way we think of it today. And I'm thinking like kind of like Braveheart when he's making that speech and he goes, would you trade every day from this to that to come back here and to tell them that they may take our land, but they'll never take our freedom. Okay. I doubt that that's like from actual history. That they didn't have a concept of freedom like we do today. So again, Brent is saying all of human history, and then he's using some idea that is extremely modern.
History has been. For much of history, individuals didn't have a lot of freedoms. Again, this experiment with democracy that the United States has gone through is pretty unique in history. And so the idea that if for much of,
I mean, let's just think about this. Go back 1,000 years. You had a freedom of speech. How could they even enforce something like that? I mean, maybe your people would enforce it by your local people that you knew, your acquaintances and stuff. They would exile you, or they wouldn't interact with you if you spoke a certain way or you had certain opinions or something. But there wasn't like any laws, like you could say it. They most likely wouldn't kill you for saying certain things. Maybe if you said some blasphemous things, yeah. But it wasn't like you had a ton of freedom because there wasn't a lot of enforcement. Now we think we have more freedom, but we might even have less freedom now today because there's so much surveillance and there's so much public square, and we can get canceled and we can get all this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, the forensic evidence of what we say and do. There's a lot more today than there was in the past. And so enforcement was much, much harder. So who knows? I mean, who are we to say that there was less freedom necessarily back then versus today? Who are we to say what they felt like? Like those people living back then, they probably thought they had quite a bit of freedom. They might have, like the French might have thought of the Germans as having no freedom and being very stiff and all this. And maybe the English thought of the Spanish being ultra Catholic and held down and oppressed. And so they had different ideas of different places, different stereotypes. But if you would ask those people living there, they probably would think that they were pretty darn free. It's just our modern interpretation of all this. So anyway, let me get my earphone back in and then we'll keep going. Like I said, just a few more minutes here.
That history, individual freedoms were not as great as they are now. It's hard for me to understand how then they also had all this freedom to just choose whatever money they wanted to choose. Again, to me, that's a contradiction. Again, I'm open to being shown where I'm wrong here, but to me, that's a contradiction. I should also say,
it's only a contradiction because you think the sovereigns choose against the market. No, the sovereigns are in the market the same way. Everybody is in the market. They don't have a choice. If it's the most marketable commodity, it's the most marketable commodity to the sovereign too. See, they don't have a choice to go against the market. They cannot go against the market's choice. They cannot. I mean, maybe for a brief period, they can impose something. But they can't sustain it for any length of time. You have to go with what the market says. That's why a lot of people will say, oh, the dollar, it's being imposed on us. The credit-based fiat dollar is being imposed on. No, it's not. The market chose that because it was hyper-elastic. And we had productive uses of that elasticity, of that credit, of that inflation. And we got more productivity than we did inflation. The market chose it. Just like, the saying that if you can inflate, you will inflate. And not just the sovereigns. Look at the people that are doing these scam tokens. They will inflate. They will pump and dump on you. It's not just the sovereigns, it's human nature. If we can inflate, we will inflate. In a credit-based system, we can inflate, but there's a limiter on that. And the limiter is the productivity that we get from lending. If you can lend $1 and you can make $2, you're damn well right. You're going to inflate. But if you can lend $1 and you only get $1 back, so you can't make any money, there's no productivity gains to be had. Those are the diminishing marginal returns I talk about. So as the first tranche of credit or the first era, the first decade of a credit-based system or whatever, you're going to have a lot of productive uses of that credit. In the next segment or era of this bubble, you're going to use up a lot of those really productive uses of credit, and it's going to go to less productive uses of credit. You do have technology that can create new uses of credit that are then hyper productive again, but those also have diminishing returns. So you get to a point where all of the productive uses of credit have been tapped out, and now you're just trying to financialize, find different ways to do financial trickeration to create some productivity on paper. That's kind of the era that we're in. And so, but really productivity is near zero for new money. And that's why the credit-based system is coming to a halt. That's why the dollar milkshake theory makes sense, because of that underlying dynamic. But it's chosen by the market. And now the market is going to choose something else. See? So, and the sovereign is subservient to the market. They can't do anything that's outside of reality. That's why communism doesn't work. Okay. Communism thinks that all you need is this managerial class. All you need is this bureaucracy, and then you can make anything that you want to happen, you can actually create if you manage it properly. But you run into reality. You run into a brick wall. And then you realize you can't make anything happen if you just do more management. Like the globalists, they think that they can make windmills, and they think they can make all this renewable energy, and they can do all these things in society with their woke ideas. If they just can manage and do propaganda enough, the right kind of propaganda in the right amount will let this be possible. We'll turn water into wine. We'll create bread and fish to feed the people if we just manage it properly. But that's not true. They can't do miracles. They have to obey reality. You eventually run into reality. And it's the same with the sovereign. So Brent would have you believe that the sovereign can make anything possible. But that's wrong. The sovereign has to obey reality. They have to obey the market. The market is reality. The market is nature. Nature is reality. You have to obey nature. You can't go against nature, or you aren't going to be surviving very long. Okay.
You are a proponent of Bitcoin because you think it is the best way to fight for the rights of the individual. Then I applaud you. I think it's a worthy goal. I think it is a fantastic objective. And if successful, I would applaud everybody involved in it. So it's not that I disagree with the idea of it. And it's not that I disagree with the...
Okay, last time to interrupt. Then we'll get to Lynn. But no, the thing is, Bitcoiners, I believe, think that this is an inevitable reality descriptor that Bitcoin will be adopted. And as such, a logical conclusion is the benefit of humanity. You see? It's a logical extrapolation from Bitcoin having the best monetary policy, best monetary properties, to being adopted, to changing the world, to fixing this. It's not that we think Bitcoin is good because it fixes this. We think Bitcoin will fix this. It's a descriptive claim. That's what reality is.
The attributes associated with it. But to me, it just doesn't square with the historical record. I would very much like to see it, but I haven't seen that happen. The other thing I would say is, my guess is that whatever comes next, we're kind of in this time period where I think part of the reason gold has done pretty well the last couple of years, Bitcoin has done fantastically well, the best performing asset in history, by most measures, is because we are kind of coming into a period where the money is not working as well as it was. And that, going back to Lynn's book, Broken Money. And I think we're getting into this period where a lot of people who maybe 50, 60 years ago would not have recognized the problems with fiat money or with money issued by the government are now starting to recognize it, right? And so I think in some ways they're planning for what comes next. And I think, I don't know, and I'm open to being wrong, I think what comes next is probably, rather than more decentralization of money, probably more centralization of money. And rather than more freedoms for the individual, probably less freedoms for the individual. Now, this is not what I want. Let's be clear. It's not what I'm hoping for. It's just that's where I see the pendulum swinging. And if we are going to have, for governments to keep control, I think they are going to have to impose more control. And that makes it very hard for me to then also accept that they are going to, at the same time, allow more freedom of choice around what quote unquote money is.
I think a big pushback I would...
Well, before I let Lynn say something, I will just say that control isn't necessarily always the goal. You know, you want to be in control of the biggest gun or of the best thing. You know, like I don't care if I can control the supply of something that nobody wants. Like let's say I'm a let's say I'm an NFT artist, okay, and I control the supply of all my stupid NFT drawings. I can control them 100%, but I don't care about controlling something that nobody else wants. You know what I mean? So it's not just control, it's specific control over a particular thing. And if you are like the elites in the West, do they want to be in control of shithole countries, or do they want to be in control of the global hegemon? They want to be in control of the global hegemon, right? So it's not about control for control's sake. It's control of certain things relative to other things. There you go. And so if you have a power to make policy, you're not going to make policy necessarily to turn your country into shit. Unless you are a communist, then you'll break everything. You'll destroy everything. You want to rule the ashes. The utopia is actually ashes, you know, for communists. But as long as you're not mentally insane and you're not a communist, then you don't want to destroy your country. You don't want to destroy the thing that you control.
Point out there is that options are important. So generally speaking, when a government sees that there's zero risk for doing what it's going to do, it'll keep doing it. It'll keep doing more of it. If the whole population is just unilaterally disarmed, for example, in multiple capacities, then the government basically has no check against it. The introduction of abilities to back on it, right? So in the United States, people talk about the Second Amendment that way, but then even in the other types of armament, it's tools. It's Bitcoin. It's also things like, you know, communication processes. You know, there's a reason if you read the Communist Manifesto, when they talk about how to implement their communism, they wanted to centralize all money and communication.
Commies. It's always commies.
Because they correctly viewed that as a challenge to what they want to do. And so things that provide decentralized alternatives that exist and that are robust make it pretty hard for them to have a complete monopoly over those things, monopoly over communication, monopoly over everybody has to use the same ledger and there's no leakage toward these alternative ledgers. The fact that these other things exist kind of keeps them to some degree honest. And we can look at other countries as examples of this. So because the dollar is something that
and they want to be honest. I mean, even the rival elites within a country are going to be keeping each other somewhat honest. You know, like you often hear, oh, you don't want to go down that road because then when the other people are in power, that they will use it against you, right? So that type of game theory, tit for tat, or what would that be? That would be a grim trigger in game theory. You don't want to defect, because then everyone will defect and nobody wins, right? So that's the game theory in that respect. There's a lot of game theory that Brent is apparently completely oblivious to when it comes to these things.
Exists. It kind of holds a lot of other fiat currencies partially in check. And so, for example, in Egypt, when their inflation is out of control, people will go on the gray market or black market, whatever it is, and they'll buy physical dollars outside of what Egyptian government's saying the official exchange rate is, and they'll do it. They'll also do it with gold, and then they do it with less liquid things like real estate. In Nigeria, they'll do it. It's a little more tech savvy. They'll do it with Bitcoin and stable coins and things like that. And so, you know, any time where the tools are available, and then importantly, they're also, you know, people are familiar with and able to use the tools. They know about the tools. They communicate the tools to other people. These represent organized pushback, and it makes it harder for the government, you know, kind of malicious government, to do what they want to do if it's not popular. And so that's why things like education on the tools matter. That's why developing those tools makes sense. And you know, that's one of the reasons. I mean, I do venture capital in the Bitcoin space to help build those tools. In many cases, I also donate to organizations without, you know, there's no return from that, just because I think it's good to exist. So rather than say talking about what I'd want to exist versus what does exist, I think it's important to acknowledge what exists, acknowledge the tools that, for example, the state has in this case. They do have a lot of powerful tools to impose things, generally speaking, because they can get some percentage of people on their side. As long as it's their person in charge, they're generally fine with giving that person power. They often lack the foresight to say, well, what happens when the next person comes in power? It's not my person anymore. They forget that part. But building these tools and making them available is an important check on power. Just like the Second Amendment is a check on power in the U.S. Decentralized messaging apps, encrypted messaging, and digital money, in this case Bitcoin, are tools. And this goes back to the whole cypherpunk era before even Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's just much more complex than what Brent is saying. It's a monolithic thing in his mind, but it's really a complex system. It's a complex system, and the elites know that it's a complex system. And so what are they going to do? They want the best tools. They want the most advantage. They're not going to be using mounted knights against tanks, okay? If they have a choice, they're going to adopt the best technology because they realize it's a complex, dynamic system. It's not monolithic. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, guys, because I've been streaming here for over 2 hours. Let's see if there's any comments. We'll check the price one more time. I'm not seeing any comments on either side of the house here. So let's go to price, share this tab. So a little bit of a pullback here, a little bit of a pump breaking out. Nothing like, no new all-time highs, but again, breaking this trend line that we discussed at the very beginning of the stream. So very good. Let's see, our futures open. Yes, futures for like a stock market. Look at that big gap up for stock market. I guess this is a reaction to Trump and the EU getting a trade deal. That some people were saying that opens up the door this week for the Fed to cut because, the Fed is worried about tariffs and the impact of tariffs on everything. There was a further pushback delay of some of the Chinese tariffs by another 90 days. So there is still some uncertainty in that respect. But yeah, so that's coming up big this week. Let's see what the dollar is doing. Dollar's down a little bit. What else we got live? Okay, so that's what we'll be watching. Guys, make sure you are subscribed over there on bitcoinandmarkets.com to get all my content. Most of my stuff is on the premium tier right now, but I did put out a blog post today, and I'll be doing some more of that stuff in the future, obviously. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ansel Lindner, and check out the Telegram. It's t.me/Bitcoin and Markets. All that stuff should be linked down in the description. So that's all I got for now. Thanks for hanging out on this Sunday, and I'll see you on the next stream. Bye.